Welcome back to the Deep Dive, where we plunge into the intricate currents of global events, sifting through the noise to bring you clarity in those crucial aha moments.
It's good to be here.
Now, for those tracking the headlines, the Iran-Israel dynamic often appears as, well, a relentless cycle of military confrontation, right? A never-ending reel of flashpoints.
It certainly seems that way on the surface.
But what truly drives these incredibly complex geopolitical chess moves? What are the hidden layers, the surprising alliances, and maybe the long-term strategies operating beneath the surface?
It's precisely that narrow, often reactive lens we aim to expand today. This deep dive is designed to move you beyond the sensational headlines.
Right. To unpack the intricate layers, challenge some common assumptions about the Middle East.
Exactly. We're going to explore the recent developments and the profound underlying strategic shifts, focusing particularly on the Iran-Israel conflict.
And crucially, the often overlooked, yet maybe increasingly pivotal role that Arab nations are playing in all this.
That's a key piece.
And to do that, we've taken a deep dive into perspectives drawn from recent, pretty compelling insights shared by Yahya Amin on YouTube. Our mission here is clear: to help you gain a nuanced understanding of who's doing what, why they're doing it, and, well, what it truly means for the region.
And by extension, for all of us globally. Prepare for some fresh perspectives and hopefully some profound insights.
Yeah, insights that might challenge your existing frameworks and stick with you long after this deep dive is over. Let's begin to unpack this complex tapestry. Okay, so to really understand the current tensions, we need to start with something quite remarkable. Almost chilling, really. A historical claim that kind of reshapes the narrative.
What's that?
Back in the mid-1990s, a perspective emerged suggesting Israel had prescribed a series of 7 wars to the U.S.
Prescribed, like a strategic blueprint.
Exactly, almost like that. And what's particularly noteworthy is the assertion that 6 of these conflicts have, well, already taken place.
6 out of 7. Okay.
Which ones? We're talking about engagements in Lebanon, Iraq, Sudan, Somalia, and Syria.
Right. Lebanon, Iraq, Sudan, Somalia, Syria. Okay, got it.
And the contention within this framework is that Iran isn't just another player. It's seen as the last remaining resistance among this initial targeted group.
Wow. That's a heavy framework. The implication is huge.
Isn't it?
It suggests the potential existence of a decades-long, predetermined strategic plan by Israel. If this framing holds true, it paints a picture of a deeply rooted, consistent strategic approach.
Where Iran is viewed not just as a reactive adversary,
but as the final, targeted piece in a larger geopolitical puzzle. It suggests a vision that extends far beyond immediate crises, meticulously mapping out regional dynamics.
Let's quickly run through those 6 countries again just to see the pattern.
Sure. Lebanon, obviously, repeated conflicts, 1982, 2006, mainly targeting Hezbollah, seen as a threat on Israel's northern border.
Right, Iraq.
Multiple interventions, culminating in the 2003 invasion that dismantled the regime, removing a historical regional rival.
Okay, Sudan.
Sudan faced missile strikes back in '98, targeting alleged chemical weapons facilities. Though, some analysts linked it to a broader strategy of weakening states perceived as supporting militant groups.
And Somalia.
Somalia's been op-ed of instability, drawing in various external forces, creating a power vacuum that strategically could be exploited.
Makes sense. And finally, Syria.
Syria, of course, embroiled in a devastating civil war, numerous external interventions, significantly weakening the Assad regime, which had strong ties to both Iran and Hezbollah.
So, from this perspective, none of these are isolated incidents.
Exactly. They become deliberate steps in a much larger, ongoing strategic narrative. The goal: to eliminate specific forms of resistance or perceived threats to Israeli security and regional influence.
This long-term view is crucial, then, for understanding the current focus on Iran.
Absolutely. It forces us to consider that current events might just be part of a much grander, maybe even preordained play.
That really does put a different, more deliberate spin on recent history. Okay, so shifting focus to Iran itself. The immediate, most persistent international concern, as most people know, is its nuclear program.
The nuclear question.
And central to managing this, at least for a while, was the 2015 Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, the JCPOA.
Right, the Iran nuclear deal.
A significant international agreement forged with the UN Security Council's P5+1, so US, UK, France, China, Russia, plus Germany.
And Iran initially complied quite meticulously, didn't they, under IAEA supervision?
They did. But what's remarkable here is how quickly even a meticulously negotiated international agreement, one backed by major world powers, can just unravel.
Yeah, due to intense domestic and international political maneuvering. It's quite something.
Benjamin Netanyahu, Israel's prime minister at the time, was vehemently opposed to the JCPOA.
Vehemently is putting it mildly. His opposition wasn't just, quiet diplomacy. He went to extraordinary lengths.
With that controversial visit to the U.S. Congress in 2015.
Exactly. Lobbying directly against the Obama administration's efforts. An unprecedented public display of disagreement between such close allies.
It highlighted just how deep Israel's concern was that the deal didn't sufficiently curb Iran's nuclear ambitions or its regional influence.
And this political fragility, fueled by intense lobbying, ultimately led to the U.S. unilaterally pulling out of the deal under Trump in 2018.
The implications of that withdrawal are still being felt, aren't they?
Oh, absolutely. Profound implications. It undermines trust in international diplomacy, makes future agreements much harder to forge.
And sets a dangerous precedent. Other nations might think, why bother if a new leader can just scrap it?
Precisely. It signals that international agreements might just be temporary, subject to the whims of domestic politics.
So considering that history, the staunch opposition, the unilateral withdrawal, it's particularly striking to hear reports now that Netanyahu might be open to re-engaging with a deal.
But with a major caveat.
Right. Under what he calls maximum pressure tactics, essentially sign the deal or face bombing.
Yeah, it's hardly a negotiation in the traditional sense.
So what does this dramatic shift, after working so hard to kill the previous deal, tell us about Israel's current strategic thinking?
Well, it reveals a deeply cynical, perhaps, but maybe also pragmatic strategic calculation.
How so?
On one hand, it could be an implicit admission that the maximum pressure campaign, while definitely hurting Iran's economy, hasn't actually achieved the goal of dismantling their nuclear program or forcing a complete surrender. Iran hasn't folded.
Okay, so pressure alone didn't work as intended.
Right. So, on the other hand, by reoffering a deal under such extreme duress, basically, a non-negotiable surrender is an attempt to formalize demands, Iran has always resisted. But now, with the explicit threat of military action as leverage.
Turning diplomacy into an ultimatum.
Exactly. Seeking to achieve through coercion what the original deal tried to achieve through, more balanced diplomacy, albeit on terms far more stringent for Iran now.
It's a high-stakes gamble, pushing Iran to the brink.
Forcing a choice. Capitulate and dismantle your strategic autonomy, or face direct military confrontation, potentially escalating things dramatically, and maybe deliberately so.
Okay, so if Iran were hypothetically forced into this corner, what are the specific demands? What exactly are the U.S. and Israel reportedly asking for?
The conditions are breathtakingly demanding. From Iran's perspective, it's basically asking for complete strategic disarmament.
Okay, like what specifically?
First, the complete transfer of all enriched uranium to a third country, and the U.S. gets to decide where it goes.
Not just limiting enrichment, but taking the whole stockpile away.
Yes, stripping them of any control, neutralizing their current nuclear progress. Second, the complete dismantlement of Iran's nuclear infrastructure.
Dismantlement, meaning taking apart the facility.
Taking apart centrifuges, cascades, the physical equipment. A total rollback and destruction of the program.
Wow. And third,
A significant curtailment of Iran's ballistic missile program, restricting range, payload, capability.
so neutralizing key aspects of both their nuclear and conventional strategic capabilities.
Precisely. Capability seen as a direct threat to regional stability and Israeli security. From Iran's viewpoint, it looks like a demand for total disarmament, leaving them completely vulnerable.
And as you lay that out, it immediately brings to mind the post-Iraq war agreement, doesn't it?
It does.
The one that drastically limited Iraq's long-range missiles to just 150 kilometers?
Right, effectively neutralizing the SKOD threat to Saudi Arabia and Israel.
It sounds eerily similar to these demands on Iran's missile program. Suggests a kind of playbook.
That historical parallel is incredibly important. It highlights a recurring pattern. Missile disarmament is seen as a direct way to remove a threat to regional allies.
For Iraq, it meant no more SKODs reaching Riyadh or Tel Aviv.
Exactly. For Iran, it would drastically reduce their ability to project power, deter attacks, or respond effectively with conventional missiles, leaving them strategically exposed.
But Iran's position on uranium enrichment has always been
Non-negotiable. That's their famous stance. They claim it's for peaceful purposes, medical isotopes, power generation, and they view enrichment as a sovereign right under the NPT.
Especially given their investments in it.
And while they might be open to discussing other terms, indirect talks are reportedly ongoing, maybe in Rome or elsewhere.
That core stance on enrichment remains a major sticking point. It's ideological and strategic for them.
Absolutely.
Which brings us back to a key question you touched on earlier. Why is Iran so wary of giving up this leverage? Especially considering history, where compliance, in their view, might have just led to more vulnerability, maybe even invasion.
That's the absolute crux of Iran's strategic calculus. It's deeply rooted in how they read recent history.
If they look at Iraq.
They look at Iraq under Saddam. They saw Iraq agree to extensive disarmament after the first Gulf War missiles, alleged WMDs, and what happened next. Not security, but more interventions, culminating in the 2003 invasion based on WMDs that, well, were never found.
In Libya, too, right? Gaddafi gave up his nuclear program.
Vividly recalled. Gaddafi voluntarily abandoned his nascent nuclear program in 2003, hoping for better relations with the West. 8 years later, regime change, NATO intervention.
So for Iran, these are serious cautionary tales.
Profound cautionary tales. Their nuclear program, even if officially peaceful, and their missile capabilities are seen as vital deterrents. Leverage against external threats, especially the U.S. and Israel.
So giving them up, especially under duress,
would, in their view, strip them of strategic autonomy, leave them exposed, just like Iraq and Libya. They fundamentally seem to believe that having a nuclear program, or at least the capability to develop one quickly, might be the only guarantee of national survival, the only way to deter a regime change attack.
It's a high-risk strategy, but understandable from their perspective.
Driven by a deep fear of vulnerability and a fierce determination to control their own destiny. This historical lens makes that non-negotiable stance on enrichment make perfect sense, strategically speaking.
Okay, let's pivot now to the more recent military actions dominating the headlines. We saw reports of U.S. attacks on 3 Iranian sites, Fordo, Natanz, and Isfahan.
With Fordo singled out.
Right, the critical underground uranium enrichment facility. These strikes were quickly celebrated by some as a major victory, a decisive blow.
But there's a very different take out there.
Exactly. Experts like the Indian military analyst Pravin Sawhney describe them quite pointedly as a show operation.
A show operation. That's a stark contrast to the initial triumphal narrative.
It is, and Sawhney's reasoning is compelling. He suggests these attacks were largely driven by U.S. domestic political pressure.
Like maybe related to election campaigns, Trump's, for instance.
Potentially. The goal from this view was to project strength and effectiveness to a domestic audience. Show action without committing to another long, costly, unpopular ground war like Iraq or Afghanistan.
Something the U.S. is desperate to avoid.
Right. Sawhney even drew a parallel to other military actions, like India's Operation Sindoor, which he saw as more about petty political gain than clear military objectives.
Interesting comparison. Yeah. Appeasing domestic pressure rather than achieving a strategic goal abroad.
And what really bolsters this propaganda view is the discrepancy in the initial Israeli media reports.
It happened there.
They initially declared Iran's nuclear capacity finished, crippled, but then within hours, they revised that significantly down to just a 2-year setback.
That quick revision is telling. Suggests managing public perception, maybe creating a victory narrative that didn't quite match reality.
It really compels you, the listener, to always question that immediate victory story. Look beyond the headlines. Was it really about crippling Iran or more about making a statement?
Critical thinking is essential there.
So if the strikes were maybe more show than substance, that leads us to Iran's military resilience. It seems like a major, often underappreciated factor.
Definitely.
Despite 45 years of sanctions, Iran is seen as having significantly greater military power than pre-war Iraq. It's frankly astonishing how they've developed high-tech gear, nuclear, missile, drone tech.
It truly is a paradox. Economic weakness, yet significant indigenous military tech advancements under decades of sanctions. It speaks volumes about their strategic foresight and long-term preparation.
The source indicates they've been actively prepping for a potential prolonged conflict for maybe 20, 22 years.
Building up robust defense and deterrence. This deep resilience explains why they won't be easily defeated by airstrikes alone.
Can you elaborate on some of those advancements?
Sure. Ballistic missiles, an impressive arsenal, some capable of reaching Israel and beyond with increasingly sophisticated guidance. Drone technology, often reverse-engineered or homegrown, surprisingly effective, challenging conventional air superiority.
And the nuclear front.
Despite scrutiny, they've mastered fuel cycle stages, centrifuge production, enrichment, steadily increasing stockpiles, and purity, getting closer to breakout capability if they choose.
And Fordo, the targeted facility.
A marvel of defensive engineering. Built deep inside a mountain, layers of rock, concrete, virtually impervious to conventional airstrikes, even B-2s with bunker busters.
So how do you neutralize something like that?
Experts contend the only way is a full-scale ground invasion.
And adding to that resilience is the population's willingness to endure hardship.
Yes, severe economic hardship rationing, relying on domestic production, a strong sense of national pride and defiance. It suggests a nation prepared for the long haul, unlike regimes that might crumble quickly. Their internal cohesion, despite economic woes, is a formidable asset.
That's a critical point. The need for a ground invasion for permanent damage. Retired U.S. Colonel McGregor, a respected strategist, agrees.
He corroborated that view.
Emphasizing that a ground invasion by the U.S. or Israel, given the current climate, is highly unlikely, prohibitively costly.
And this brings us straight back to those crucial, painful lessons from recent history.
Iraq and Afghanistan.
Exactly. The costly, regrettable ground interventions that became prolonged economic and human liabilities for over a decade. The memory is still fresh.
Trillions of dollars, immense human cost.
It makes another large-scale, open-ended ground invasion politically toxic and economically unsustainable for the U.S. The public appetite just isn't there. Neither is the financial bandwidth.
And there's an ironic historical precedent involving Israel itself, isn't there?
Yes, fascinatingly. Israel's own attacks on Iraq's nuclear facilities, Iraq in '81, then again in '83. Did they eliminate the threat?
No, apparently they spurred Iraq to accelerate its clandestine nuclear program.
Precisely. It suggests preemptive strikes can backfire, fuel the ambitions they seek to suppress. A powerful reminder that military solutions are rarely straightforward, often have unintended consequences, and could deepen the target's resolve.
Okay, so connecting this to the bigger picture, considering Iraq, Afghanistan, does the U.S. or even Israel really have the capacity, economic, military, political will for another ground war now?
Especially with China and Russia rising.
Yeah, their interests in the Middle East have only grown, and Russia's ties with Iran are deeper than they ever were with pre-war Iraq, right?
That adds another layer of complexity.
It absolutely does. The geopolitical landscape has shifted dramatically. The U.S. faces a more assertive challenge from China and Russia, both strengthening ties with Iran economic, military, intelligence.
So a war in Iran would divert resources.
Immense resources, military assets, strategic attention away from other critical global arenas, potentially undermining U.S. positions against these rivals.
And Russia specifically.
Russia has a vested interest in Iran's stability. Shared borders, alliances in Syria, arms supplies. Unlike Iraq, where Russian influence was limited, intervening against Iran involves a much more complex web.
Russia might see it as a threat to its own influence.
Likely, potentially leading to overt or covert support for Iran. So it's not just about military capacity anymore. It's global strategic bandwidth, economic sustainability, and risking a wider, uncontrollable conflict that could reshape the global order.
The risks seem to far outweigh potential benefits. That seems to be the calculation.
Okay, moving beyond direct military clashes, let's look at the broader, more subtle geopolitical chessboard. We're hearing about significant Russian and Chinese intelligence involvement with Iran.
A level of cooperation suggesting potentially more aggressive Iranian responses or attacks on Israel, possibly with their support.
But what's really fascinating is that Russia, despite these ties, somehow maintains pretty good relations with both Iran and Israel.
Yeah, that's a unique position. It positions Russia as a potential mediator for a ceasefire, oddly enough.
Which leads to this really profound notion of a controlled conflict. Can you unpack that?
Sure. It's not about one side winning outright or a quick end. It suggests a high-stakes dance where major powers, U.S., Russia, China, even key Arab states, might actually be strategically comfortable with certain outcomes.
Comfortable with what?
Maybe a downsizing of Israel's current hardline regime, or a shift away from Iran's current proxy war approach, but without it spiraling into a full regional war.
So a managed conflict, not necessarily resolution.
Exactly. A complex game where total victory for one side isn't the desired outcome for the global players. Each has different underlying objectives.
Like the U.S. maybe wanting to reduce the liability of Israel's hardline policies.
Possibly. Policies seen as destabilizing, complicating broader U.S. goals, maybe hindering ties with Arab nations.
And Russia and China.
Supporting Iran helps balance U.S. influence, challenges unipolarity, but without wanting a chaotic war disrupting energy markets or causing refugee crises. They might aim for a more multipolar Middle East, where their influence grows.
And Russia's dual relationship is key here.
Pivotal. It makes them a potential off-ramp or channel for de-escalation if things get too hot. It suggests a shared interest, perhaps, in managing the conflict.
Allowing limited conflict to achieve strategic shifts, but keeping a lid on it.
That's the idea. Using back channels, diplomatic pressure, maybe even covert actions to prevent total escalation, protecting their own broader interests. A delicate, high-wire act.
And speaking of shifting dynamics, we're seeing a really notable change in the narrative coming from traditional legacy U.S. media. Fox News, CNN, BBC, New York Times.
What are you noticing?
Well, unlike past conflicts, Vietnam, Afghanistan, Iraq, where these outlets were often pretty uniformly aligned with intervention and supporting allies.
They often rallied public support, right? Aligned with government narratives.
Exactly. But now, they're increasingly featuring guests who openly express opposition to direct U.S. support for Israel in this current conflict.
That is a significant departure, almost unprecedented.
The example of former President Bill Clinton appearing on legacy media, arguing against U.S. involvement in supporting Israel's actions, that's striking.
It really is.
Yeah.
Historically, these platforms often amplified official lines. This shift could reflect a few things.
Like what?
Maybe a growing sentiment in the West that Israel's current regime is becoming a liability financially, globally, strategically, an obstacle to broader interests.
Or maybe the media itself is trying to shape opinion.
Could be a preemptive attempt to prepare the public for a less interventionist stance, maybe signaling a recalibration of U.S. policy, moving away from unconditional support.
It highlights the media's power, even now, in shaping perception and signaling these deeper shifts.
Absolutely. It implies a recognition that the narrative is shifting, and these outlets are adapting, maybe even leading that shift, reflecting a new reality.
Which ties directly into the idea of Israel's mounting costs. The perception it's becoming a liability. The financial burden Iran has inflicted is staggering estimates around $500 billion in infrastructure and collective losses.
$500 billion. That's enormous.
And you add Israel's official daily defense spending around $300 million USD a day. Compare that to Israel's total GDP, roughly $600 billion.
Wait, $300 million a day?
It starkly underscores the financial strain, the potential long-term unsustainability without massive, continuous external support.
The raw numbers there really speak volumes. They're a powerful indicator. That scale of cost relative to their GDP is, well, it's a surprising fact many overlook.
$500 billion is almost their entire annual economic output.
And $300 million a day means, what, in less than 2 years they've spent their entire GDP just on defense for this conflict.
Roughly, yeah. It raises fundamental questions about sustainability without that external support, primarily from the U.S.
And these escalating costs are a major, if maybe unspoken, driver behind that perception of the current regime being a liability in the West.
It's not just about humanitarian concerns or geopolitics.
It's cold, hard economics, too. The financial drain becomes unsustainable without constant aid. This burden, plus the shifting media narrative, it strongly suggests a potential, maybe inevitable, reevaluation of alliances and priorities.
If an ally becomes too costly financially, diplomatically,
the calculus of support inevitably shifts. How much longer can they be propped up, and at what cost to the patron's own interests, especially with global challenges like China and Russia demanding attention?
Okay, let's shift focus now to the crucial, often misunderstood role of Arab states. There's this common misconception, especially among some Muslims, that money spent on Hajj and Umrah pilgrimages somehow indirectly harms Palestinians.
Right, the argument that boycotting Hajj would somehow stop the conflict.
Yeah. But what does a deeper look at the data actually tell us?
Well, factually, it's a misconception that generates unhelpful internal divisions. Abstaining from Hajj wouldn't practically impact the Israel-Palestine conflict. The economic impact is vastly exaggerated.
How so?
Hajj and Umrah contribute less than 20% to Saudi GDP. Some recent estimates put it under 10%.
So it's not their main economic driver.
Not even close. It's overwhelmingly oil and gas, plus massive diversification investments, tech, tourism, entertainment, part of their Vision 2030.
And look at Qatar, the UAE.
Exactly. Incredibly wealthy, clearly not reliant on pilgrimage revenue. The source also points out the hypocrisy often seen, where critics might have families studying or working in Western countries that overtly support Israel.
So the argument is more about fostering unity. Avoid self-defeating divisions.
Precisely. And it's worth remembering, Arab nations like Saudi Arabia and Qatar provide substantial, often unconditional, aid globally, disaster relief, infrastructure, education in places like Bangladesh, Africa. It shows another side of their engagement.
So, dispelling myths with data. And what's encouraging, according to Yahya Amin's insights, is this emerging view of greater unity. Saudi Arabia, Qatar, Syria, Iran, actively seeking cooperation.
That's seen as a very positive development for broader Muslim interests and potentially for the Palestinian cause.
A key victory here, maybe under-celebrated, is the lifting of economic sanctions on Syria.
Sanctions imposed way back in 1978 by the U.S. at Israel's urging to weaken Syria's economy.
And now lifted. Through whose efforts?
Coordinated efforts by Turkey and robust Arab diplomacy. This now allows much-needed investment and rebuilding in Syria. It signals a major geopolitical shift. What's fascinating is how these diplomatic efforts, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, Turkey, are being framed. The objective, as the source puts it, is aiming to create a kind of new, prosperous Europe in the Middle East. Economically integrated, militarily strong, politically cohesive.
That directly challenges the old Western policy of keeping the region divided and weak.
Absolutely. A fundamental shift towards strategic autonomy. They're shaping their own future.
And we're seeing explicit demands now regarding Palestine.
Yes, Arab leaders demanding Palestinian state recognition and security as an absolute precondition for normalization with Israel. Moving beyond past agreements like the Abraham Accords that downplayed the issue. Collective leverage.
And lifting Syria's nearly 50-year sanctions is proof of this new diplomatic muscle.
A powerful, tangible example. And it's surprising for many to realize the current strong ties between Syria's leadership and Turkey, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, a complex web of regional diplomacy often missed in Western narratives.
A profound realignment, challenging that perception of Arab fragmentation.
Showing a concerted effort towards regional self-determination.
Okay, this leads to the strategic use of investments. Arab nations invest heavily in the U.S., which sometimes draws criticism seen as wasteful or just placating the West. But there's an alternative view. These aren't just economic moves, but a strategic maneuver to gain influence in the White House, maybe even beating AIPAC at its own game.
That's a crucial interpretation, challenging simplistic analyses. It suggests these financial flows have multi-layered, long-term geopolitical goals.
Like Saudi Arabia's big investments in AI, attracting top talent.
Exactly. And their sovereign wealth fund pouring money into U.S. tech and infrastructure. It built deep-seated influence, economic interdependence, leverage directly in Washington.
So the argument is this influence has had real effects.
The source argues Arab diplomacy, spearheaded by Saudi Arabia and Qatar, has been instrumental in preventing a full-blown war with Iran, which many thought was imminent. Even suggesting this influence led Trump to bypass Israel for direct talks with Palestinians and Iranians, a shift unthinkable just years before. It shows how direct Arab influence, fueled by investments, can work differently than traditional lobbying.
It really challenges you, the listener, to see a sophisticated long game converting financial power into political leverage.
Shaping policy from within.
And speaking of leverage, there's this measurable shift in the narrative war. Netanyahu himself admitted Israel is losing the narrative war globally.
He conceded that. Why?
Largely due to social media, TikTok, Facebook, YouTube exposing realities on the ground, including alleged genocidal actions, unfiltered, in real time.
And the source identifies specific players leading this.
Al Jazeera, funded by Qatar, is seen as at the forefront, followed closely by Turkish media like TRT.
Highlighting their critical strategic importance as powerful mouthpieces for Muslim perspectives globally, directly countering established narratives.
They're shaping global opinion, challenging dominant views.
Exactly. Providing crucial, often courageous coverage, disseminating raw footage, alternative analyses, bypassing traditional filters, often at immense personal risk.
The high number of journalists from these networks killed or injured in Palestine is tragic evidence of that risk.
Absolutely. Netanyahu's admission is telling. It acknowledges that traditional information control is eroding, challenged by decentralized social media and alternative news sources.
This shift in the narrative war has profound implications
for international support, diplomatic leverage, public sentiment, making it harder for certain actions to go unchallenged. It's a battle for hearts and minds, and the landscape is undeniably shifting, a rebalancing of information power.
Okay, finally, let's explore this idea of a perceived Mandela effect of diplomacy. Why might actions of smaller Arab nations like Qatar be misunderstood? Why diplomacy and media over direct military aggression?
The source explains this by pointing to cautionary tales, the fates of other nations that did militarily challenge U.S. or Western interests.
Who are they looking at?
Libya. Gaddafi removed after challenging the U.S. dollar, seeking an African currency. Egypt. Morsi, overthrown after being perceived as opposing U.S.-Israeli interests, aligning with Hamas. Pakistan. Imran Khan jailed after challenging U.S. foreign policy, seeking independence, closer ties with China, Russia.
So these are vivid lessons for them.
Yeah.
The cost of direct confrontation.
Immense costs. Plus, consider the raw numbers. Collective Arab GDP, maybe $6 trillion. U.S. GDP, around $28 trillion. That disparity makes direct military confrontation impractical, almost suicidal.
So how does the source illustrate their strategic rationale?
With a powerful analogy. Imagine 3 people by a river seeing dead children floating downstream. 2 jump in frantically, pulling them out. Immediate visible heroism. Applauded action.
Okay, and the third person?
The third person turns and goes upstream. This person, representing Arab diplomacy and long-term influence, might seem inactive, detached, maybe even hypocritical to those focused on the immediate crisis.
But they're going upstream.
To find and stop whoever is killing the children at the source.
Addressing the root cause.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It illustrates how smaller entities might choose a strategic, long-term approach, diplomacy, investment, media over direct conflict, aiming for systemic change from within, influencing policies at their root.
It requires a nuanced understanding, looking beyond surface judgments.
Appreciating the complex, often hidden strategic calculations. From the source's view, it underscores needing unity and strategic patience. What looks like inaction might be a considered long-game strategy for systemic change. Hashtag tag outro.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, we've journeyed through these complex, shifting sands of the Middle East. We've peeled back layers often hidden beneath the headlines, explored the deep history of the Iran-Israel conflict, considering that perspective on long-term plans, and Iran's surprising resilience, even under sanctions.
And crucially, looking at the often misunderstood but increasingly influential role of Arab nations.
Right, leveraging diplomacy, economics, media to really reshape the geopolitical landscape.
And if we connect all this to the bigger picture, it leads to a truly thought-provoking conclusion, doesn't it?
Which,
in a world where overt conflict and military action grab the headlines, what if the most impactful battles are increasingly fought, and maybe won, through less visible means?
economic leverage, sophisticated media narratives, quiet, long-game diplomacy.
Exactly. Consider how these invisible strategies might be more profoundly reshaping global power dynamics, forging new alliances, achieving long-term goals more effectively than direct military clashes.
And what that truly means for the future of international relations.
The Middle East, in this view, becomes a crucible for a new kind of geopolitical contest, one demanding a far more nuanced understanding than headlines provide.
Forcing us to rethink what power and victory really mean in the 21st century.
A lot to chew on there.